Here, Twilight. I found some tea bags in the kitchen, Spike said, holding up the warm cup of tea to the lavender unicorn. Thanks, Spike, Twilight mumbled quietly. She levitated the cup to her mouth and slowly sipped on the tea. It had taken a while to get the strength back in her legs, but once they had recovered, Spike led her down to the living room. Somehow, he'd managed to find a blanket and wrap it around her. In this moment of need, he was proving to her that he really was her number one assistant. I'm sorry, Spike. Twilight sighed softly, looking into the murky waters of her tea. I should be the one who's strong right now, not you. Twilight, how are your wounds? Spike interrupted her, looking at her seriously. Twilight blinked, a little confused, before looking down at her body. She shifted the blanket a little to get a better look at the damage that had been done. Her chest was swelling, though she was actually surprised at how small it was. She had expected bigger bruises from the way that it had felt, but she seemed surprisingly well off there. They were also the worst of her injuries. The cuts she had received from the creature's mouth had already stopped bleeding. My wounds are fine, Spike. But why is that? You got hurt, Twilight. I'm fine. You rest for the moment, and we'll continue when you're ready, Spike interrupted her, with a soft smile. Twilight blinked in confusion at him, before returning the smile. Sometimes, I wonder if you really are a baby dragon anymore. Twilight chuckled softly, closing her eyes to sip her tea. Yeah, I'm growing up pretty fast. Spike nodded happily. There was a comfortable shared silence between the two of them, leaving Twilight to her thoughts as she drank the warm liquid. Spike smiled as he watched Twilight relax, before softly scratching the back of his head. Hey, Twilight, I know it's a little soon, but... Twilight looked up at her dragon assistant from the rim of her cup. When we were in the room, I saw a key on the door next to that thing. I think that might have been the key to the door. I didn't grab it because it was helping you, but... Say no more, Spike. Twilight softly nodded her head, putting the cup down and standing up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. I'll go grab the key. Wait, are you sure? Maybe you should just... Spike tried to stop her from acting hastily, but Twilight just held out a hoof to silence him. Thanks for the concern, Spike. But I'm okay now. Besides, I can handle retrieving a small key from a room. I can't let you do everything. She took a deep breath. I'm supposed to be taking care of you, not the other way around. She smiled softly at him. It's okay to need help, Twilight. Spike furrowed his brow, looking at her worriedly. I know, and if I need it, then I'll ask. Twilight rubbed his head gently. I'll be okay. Just wait for me. I'll be right back. All right, Twilight. I trust you. Spike still looked at the lavender unicorn with worry, but did as he was asked. Thank you, Spike. She nodded before turning to the stairs. She looked up the flight towards the walkway that led to the room she'd escaped from, swallowed a lump that had formed in her throat, and slowly began her ascent back up. Come on, Twilight. If Spike can handle this, you can too. He's just a baby dragon. You're an adult unicorn, and Celestia's personal assistant. You can face what you did. She mentally reassured herself several times. She could feel her face flushing with anxiety, her heart beating more heavily with each hoof step. She was trying to force herself to stay calm, taking deep breaths before repeating to herself that everything would be okay. At the top of the steps, she hesitated and looked at the half-open doorway leading to the destroyed room. Even as she approached, she could glimpse some of the rubble and destruction within, most prominently the splatters of blood that had come from the thrashing. You okay, Twilight? Spike's voice carried from the first floor. Yeah, I'm fine, Spike. She quickly flashed him an assuring smile before walking to the door and stepping inside. A hoof went straight to her mouth as she observed the remains of the room. The creature's corpse was still there in the center, lying limp in a pool of its own blood. She couldn't look away, only barely able to discern the destroyed decorations everywhere. The wrecked walls, the ceiling, and the room of utter chaos laid out around her. But something was also amiss. Something about the room didn't seem right, as if some important detail that she had left there was no longer where it should be. The sword! Why isn't it still... Twilight stared in shock at the head of the creature. The sword should have been impaled through it, but it wasn't there. Instead, looking just in front of the creature, she saw it lying on the ground, not a speck of blood upon it. Right next to it, on the floor, she saw a small glint of light reflecting off of a small key. Had the sword fallen out of its head? Had it not actually been dead and managed to pull the sword out before it died? Had something else come along and pulled it out? Had she or Spike pulled it out without either of them realizing it? Were they still not alone? Twilight gulped down another lump nervously that had formed in her throat. Not daring to take another step into the room, she felt fortunate that her desired items were already within her line of sight. She quickly lit her horn up and wrapped the sword and key with a magical aura, the two items quickly disappearing into their waiting storage inside of her pool of magic, and the room grew dim once more. She hadn't planned on bringing the sword with her, but if more things were going to go wrong, then she might need to defend herself again. Not wanting to see what surprises might pop out at her, Twilight quickly turned around and headed back down the stairs. "Okay, Spike, I grabbed the key. Let's go ahead and get out of this place," Twilight said, trying to hide her desire to leave from Spike as she hurried past him. "Oh, sure, Twilight. Once we head out, we should continue looking for your friends and the princess," Spike suggested, making a mental note of the task at hand while following after the lavender unicorn. Twilight wasted no time in turning her pendant on and illuminating the kitchen. She summoned the key once more and approached the locked door, fitting the key into the lock. With a turn of the key, she opened the lock, and with a push of the hoof on the door, revealed the fog-laden world just beyond it. It led to the backyard of the house, which was surrounded by a small fence, cornering it off from the streets of Ponyville. It seemed a small garden used to be raised there, but the small patch of vegetables had fallen into a state of rotten disuse. The grass was dying, and the air suddenly felt thick. "Whoa, look, Twilight, it's snowing again," Spike said eagerly, running into the backyard without a care. "Spike, wait! We don't know if it's safe yet," Twilight cried out, chasing after the baby dragon. Spike didn't seem to care, though, just looking up into the fog-filled skies as specks of white floated down around him. He briefly spun in place before opening his mouth and sticking out his tongue, letting one of the flakes land on his tongue. Instantly, he retched and started spitting, wiping his mouth of the vile snowflake. "Ugh, that wasn't snow at all," Spike groaned as Twilight walked up next to him. "Not snow? What do you mean it's not snow?" Twilight wondered, looking up at the flakes. She held out a hoof with a speck landed on it. She expected it to be cold and to melt. Instead, it seemed to smear onto her coat. Perplexed, she drew her nose close to it, but didn't notice any smell aside from the thick smell that seemed to hang in the air. Curious about what Spike had tasted, she licked the speck that had landed on her hoof. "This isn't snow," Twilight whispered to herself, suddenly realizing what was falling from the sky. "It's ash." Suddenly, the thick smell of the air made sense and brought a horrible realization to her mind. Either something in Ponyville was burning, or these were the remains of something that had been burnt and scattered throughout the city. Twilight?" Spike said suddenly, scared of something. Twilight looked down at the baby dragon, before looking to where his eyes had followed. She regretted what she'd saw. It must have been the owner of the house, or at least what was left of her. It was a mare she vaguely recognized. One of the newest ponies to move to Ponyville. She had a strikingly white coat and a silver mane. Her body was covered in lacerations, as if she had been severely whipped all over, staining her white coat with blood. But worst of all was that she had been mounted to a large wooden cross, with giant nails piercing each of her hooves and holding her in place. The mare which had this happened was named Winter Withers. Winter had been crucified. Oh, Celestia, we have to get her down, Twilight said, racing over to the crucified pony. She wrapped the mare in her magic, gripping hard against the nails before pulling them out carefully. The body went limp in Twilight's magical embrace as she carefully lowered the pony to the ground. As the white mare lay there, Twilight put a hoof to her neck, desperate for any sign of life. Is she? Spike sputtered, walking up slowly. Twilight was quiet for a few minutes, hoping for a conclusion that wasn't what Spike was thinking. She checked several spots where she knew she would be able to feel a heartbeat. She put her ear next to her mouth to try and hear breathing. Finally, her horn lit up, and she pulled a small blanket of magic on her chest to try and detect a heartbeat. Twilight's face grew dim as the magic of her horn faded, closing her eyes and softly shaking her head. Oh no. Why is this happening, Twilight? Spike asked, now truly scared. It had been one thing for Spike when he had seen a monster dead, but it was another seeing a pony mutilated and hung up for display. I don't know, Spike, Twilight spoke softly, looking down at the mare's face. Winter was a face she rarely saw in the streets of Ponyville. Someone who had recently moved there to get away from her city life and enjoy a peaceful one there. They'd only talked on 2 occasions, and with it being a small town, she was having a hard time adjusting to every pony knowing every pony else. Twilight stood up, her horn lighting up once again. With her magic, she quickly formed a shovel and began to dig up the dirt of the backyard. Spike watched silently as Twilight dug a hole. The two of them could only hear the stifled sounds of the shovel digging into the dirt as she dug deeper. It took a long time for the hole to be deep enough to satisfy Twilight, yet not a word was shared between the two of them. Twilight carefully wrapped the mare's body in her magic and placed it down to the hole. Picking up the excavated dirt with her magic, she gingerly put it back in place, covering the mare and filling the hole. She made sure the dirt was meticulously flat before forming a block of wood into the shape of a headstone and placing it in front of the grave. She carefully etched onto it, "Here lays Winter Withers. May she find a peaceful rest." Twilight sat at the foot of the freshly dug grave, looking solemnly at the ground. Spike walked up and sat next to her, putting a claw against her back. "Maybe we should say a few words?" Spike motioned solemnly. "You're right, but I barely know anything about her. I met her briefly, Spike. Enough to know her name and why she moved, but she was just a passing friend." Twilight sighed softly, not sure what to make of it. Just knowing every pony in Ponyville wasn't enough to call them true friends. If she only had one conversation, she could maybe call them a friend, but she didn't truly know a pony in that case. It took a while to truly earn great friends like the ones she had. "Winter," Twilight spoke up softly. "I'm sorry I never got to know you that well. You seemed like an interesting pony, and I know you were starting to enjoy life here in Ponyville. You were starting to make friends, and who knows, maybe you could have become a great member of the community." Twilight paused for a moment, turning her head away from the grave, feeling guilt hit her stomach. "And I'm sorry you had to die this way. You didn't deserve this. No pony deserves this." She took a deep breath and looked back at the grave. "And I promise, your death won't have been in vain. We may not have been the closest of friends, but you were still one of mine. And I'll put a stop to whatever's going on here, Winter. You have my word." Twilight stood, feeling the weight of her words in her heart. Spike looked up at the unicorn, not sure how to feel anymore. In the span of a few minutes, the two of them had been through more emotions than they had ever thought they'd go through in a lifetime. The young dragon's body was surrounded with magic as Twilight lifted him up onto her back. "All right, Spike. We have to find the others now. We can't leave things like this, not if innocent ponies are getting hurt." Twilight spoke with near vengeance in her voice. But Twilight, what if they... Spike hesitated, looking back at the bloody crucifix that stood impaled into the ground before them. Twilight looked at the device, glaring at it. Twilight was reminded of when she had read about the horrible devices, where she had learned what being killed this way was called, in the biography of Merlin the Great. "Upon hilltops of St. Kleinsrow, there I saw a ghastly sights of our fellow blood, nailed to wood in the shape of a cross to serve two purposes, one of execution, the other of warning. Their bodies spoke of the atrocities the nation would commit if you broke their laws, invaded their land, or offended their nobles. The fate of death was brought to you. You would be seen by those you knew and loved, by your enemies, and by your goddess, that you were an example of their power. They called this execution the crucifixion." Twilight grit her teeth as her horn flared once more. The bloody cross was gripped in her magic, and let out a groan as the wood began to bend. With a loud and powerful snap, the cross fell over, slamming into the ground in two pieces. Twilight stared with satisfaction at her work, and walked towards the edge of a small picket fence that surrounded Winter's yard. "Our friends are going to be okay, Spike. They wouldn't let this town get them so easily. Now hold on," Twilight told the baby dragon. Taking her advice, he gripped tightly to her neck as she took hold of a few steps back and galloped at full speed. She cleared the fence in a single jump, landing once more onto the cobble streets of Ponyville. "Spike, do you know where we are in town at the moment?" Twilight asked, pulling out the map from her pool of magic and handing it to Spike. Spike fumbled with it for a moment, before opening it up properly. He swallowed down nervousness that had been building up as he cleared his throat, examining the map. "I'd guess we're on Penn Street?" Spike followed the roads, noticing the buildings that had been around before being chased into the mansion. Then the location of the mansion itself. "So, Sugar Cube Corner should still be the nearest place. We just have to head to the right and down the road," Spike explained. Just as he finished up, though, the medallion on Twilight's neck began to let out a buzz. "What's that?" Spike said, jumping into the air and landing on Twilight's back. Twilight grunted at the sign and sighed softly. "It's something I found in the house that seemed important." Twilight lifted the necklace of her pendant to show Spike the medallion that was attached to it. "It was doing that back in the house, too. It was acting like this right before..." Twilight was interrupted by the sound of metal scraping against the cobblestones. Spike and Twilight instantly turned their attention to the direction of the noise, seeing a silhouette of a pony once more. "Oh no, not more of them!" Twilight growled, reaching for her magic, and swiftly pulling out the ancient rusted sword. And she inspected the condition of it, noting that it was still holding together well despite her recent encounter. She feared that it was on the verge of breaking, many of the chips digging into the blade. However, it was something to defend her and the young one she had to protect. So help Celestia, if anything, come harm to Spike. "Twilight, let's get out of here," Spike said, tugging on her mane. We shouldn't fight it. It'll draw more. We're not surrounded already? Twilight quickly glanced around, seeing only that silhouette around them was in fact the only one, slowly approaching them. Looking back at the figure in the fog, she began to slowly walk backwards away from it. The figure didn't pick up any speed, just continued to saunter slowly towards them, dragging whatever weapon it carried along the ground. We're not going to get any closer to our friends if we keep running away. But I understand. We shouldn't fight if we don't have to. Twilight returned the sword to her magic, then quickly turned and ran from the creature. It didn't chase them, and the silhouette fell out of view. As it did, the buzzing from the medallion grew silent. Hey, that sound went away, Spike said, taking note of the silence returning as Twilight moved into a quick jog after a full sprint. Hey, you're right, Spike, she said, slowing to a walk as she examined the runic symbols on the metal. It seems to make noise whenever a creature draws close. I think it's warning of its danger when it draws near. Twilight was amused at this deduction. That something she found was so useful. Well, that's convenient, Spike said, reaching around and poking the medallion softly. If it makes a noise whenever danger is near, all we have to do is avoid dangerous areas. I don't know if it'll be that easy, Spike, Twilight said, thinking back to the mansion. We only got the key to leave because I killed that thing. It dropped the key when it died, and the medallion was buzzing before I even encountered it. Twilight sighed as she thought about it, putting the pieces together in her head. Whatever's going on in this town, it seems to be following some strange rule set. You have to follow the rules, or else you won't get out. Are you sure, Twilight? That makes it seem like this is someone's trying to play a game with us or something. Spike scratched his head at the words. Maybe, Spike. But think about it. When we were locked away in the library, we couldn't escape until we solved the puzzles in those boxes. Then we finally got outside. We were rounded up into that mansion. Then, the only way out, safely, was through that creature. Twilight listed the events for them to analyze logically. So, you're saying the only way out of this mess is to obey whatever rules they present us with? Spike felt a chill run down his back as he spoke. I'm afraid so, Spike. And it seems the consequences of disobeying the rules are dire. Spike spoke gravely. Do you think that's what happened to Winter? Twilight stopped walking, head instantly lowering to stare at the ground. Sorry, Spike began to mumble. I don't know, Spike. Twilight sighed, lifting her head up. But Winter, she was crucified. And when you crucify a pony, it isn't just to kill them. It's to send a message. Twilight narrowed her eyes again. And I think the message was intended for us. I don't know what it meant, but I plan on finding out. Spike didn't say anything after that. He just sat on Twilight's back as she began to walk once more. The only sound the two of them heard was a loud click of her hooves hitting the cobblestone. The road she was heading down would eventually lead to a fork, where she could either turn to head to the school, or down further into Ponyville. Twilight came to a dead stop at the end of the road, her mouth falling apart as she stared at the building that had appeared before them in the fog. Whoa, I don't remember that building being in Ponyville, Spike said, looking at it in confusion. That's because it doesn't belong to Ponyville, Twilight explained, looking at the building once more. Where more houses should have been, there was a large brick building. A small flight of stairs stood before double doors leading into the building. Above them was a weathered sign, seemingly battered by the elements, that read, Stalliongrad Library. Well, If it doesn't belong in Ponyville, what is it doing here? Spike asked, perplexed. Not accustomed to buildings suddenly shifting entire locations like this. I'm not sure, Spike, but I'm certain we're supposed to find out, Twilight said, stepping closer to the building. Are you sure this is a good idea, Twilight? Spike asked hesitantly, as she began to climb the stairs. Good idea? Probably not. But if this is Stalingrad Library, there might be other ponies inside. One of our friends might have taken refuge in here. Twilight slowly pushed the front door, finding a dark abyss inside waiting for them. Or we might find out more clues as to what happened here.